Hello, this is William Hitchcock, and I am recording this on June 8th, 2020. This is the last of our what if analysis spreadsheets that we're working with a loan spreadsheet. The next time when we come back, we can try some things with commissions and bakeries and do things like that. But for this one, we're going to be focusing on the last of the three what if tools that Excel has, those three being GoalSeek, data tables, and then finally the scenario manager. So with a scenario manager, how that one differs is you can have one or more input variables and one or more output variables. So normally where you'd use a scenario manager is if you're going to have multiple inputs, multiple outputs, you want to see all sorts of things that are kind of changing and moving around, and we want to come up with a few different scenarios. Normally what you're going to do for scenarios is I would always recommend kind of have maybe four scenarios. One is you want whatever the current state is. This is what we think is going to, this is kind of happening right now. This is what we think is the possibility. Second scenario we wanted to have is we want a worst case. What would happen if, you know, say if we're doing a scenario for a business, what would happen if our sales decreased by 50%? What would happen if the cost of our that our suppliers are charging us increases by 30%? All of those kind of worst case scenarios. Then we'll have a third scenario would be the most likely. This is most likely what's going to be happening, say in the next year, the next couple of years. And then finally, you'd have your fourth scenario is the best case. Beyond our somewhat beyond our wildest dreams, what do you think the best case is? Now, with worst case and best case, it's important that you come up with something that's kind of realistic. Um, and depending on how much risk there is in the market and whatever else, that can vary an awful lot. But you don't want to come up with something that, most likely couldn't ever happen except once every 500 years. I mean, that's what we do for flood planning, for example. But, for a lot of business things, you want to kind of say, all right, what's the best case scenario? Realistically, what could possibly happen? Because if it's anything that's better than that, good thing. Same thing with a worst case scenario. I mean, if things really get that bad, most likely what happens is the company goes bankrupt and, you know, that's what happened. We start over again sometime in the future. All right. So back to our loan spreadsheet. What I've got is I've got my cost of my home, the down payment, the APR, the years borrowed, and so on. And what I want to do is find out what happens in a best case scenario, worst case, and so on. So this is our current situation. We think that we can afford a $270,000 home at with a $10,000 payment, APR, annual percentage rate 6%. We'll borrow it for 30 years, make 12 payments per year. And I want to find out what's going to be my monthly payment, how much do I have to pay back, and do all things like that. All right. Second thing about the scenario manager, one thing that really helps the output on these is if you used range names. And in our first clip, I showed you how to create range names for these cells. For example, here's the cost of the home. I took that name and applied it to cell B2. And if you look up here in the name box, it lists all of those named cells. Now, if you don't name your cells, it's just going to reference the cell location B2, B3, B4, which makes it just a little bit more awkward to read your output. So use range names, it will help a lot. All right, let's go in here. We'll go to data. We'll choose what if analysis. I'm going to choose the scenario manager. And it pops up this dialog box that says there's no scenarios to find. Choose add to add them. And, it's kind of this scratch my head. Not sure what I got to do here, but let's give it a try. The first time you do it, it is a little bit messy. But once you've got it set up, it's not too bad. So let's go to, it says choose add to add scenarios. I'll choose that. We've got the scenario name, so I'll just say that that's the current. Then where it says changing cells. Now for the changing cells, highlight whatever it's got in there, and then go ahead and click on those cells that you want to change. Now I want to be able to change the cost of the home, the down payment, the APR, the euros borrowed. I'm going to change all of these inputs, right? So theoretically, if they're all one right after the other, you can just choose and grab a range like that, B2 to B6. Or if for some reason you want to change the cost of the home and the APR, I'll hold my control key and click on those cells that I want to choose. So by holding the control key, you can select different ones, right? Like I said, I want to choose all of these. So I'm just clicking and dragging to select those. Comment, you could decide, leave that in there. I would leave it in there. It'll be fine. Hit OK. Then it's got my current values. Cost of the home is 270,000. Down payment is 10,000. APR 0.06, 6%. Yours, that looks good. I can either just hit OK, but that means I've just got one scenario. So instead, I want to add another scenario. So I'll click this, and I said our second scenario is going to be the worst case. Changing cells, it's the same set of cells that I wanted to change from before. So I'll hit OK. My worst case scenario is the cost of my home. I can only afford a $200,000 home. My down payment, I've got to make at least 10% of that, so I'll say it's $20,000. The APR, worst case scenario, rates jump up to 0.09%. Years borrowed, we'll leave that at 30. Payments per year, 12, that's fine. I can hit add and add another scenario. So let's do the most likely. Changing cells again is the same. I'll hit OK. And in this case, most likely what's going to happen is I'm going to have a $300,000 home. My down payment I'll say is $15,000. My APR is 0.05. The years borrowed, I'm going to shrink that down to 15 years and leave the payments per year at 12. Finally, best case scenario. Hit OK. Best case scenario, I can afford a $600,000 home. My down payment, I can afford to pay $50,000 down. My APR is 0.055. Years borrowed we'll say is 20 years, just to change the numbers somewhat so you can see them. And finally, OK. So I've got all these different scenarios, the current, the worst case, the most likely, the best case. So if I choose worst case and hit show, it plugs those values in, tells me what the periodic payment is, and everything is changed. Here's my most likely. Double click on it or click most likely and show. There's my $300,000 inputs and so on. And then let's see, that periodic payment was $2,250. Best case scenario, the $600,000 home at 20 years. I'm looking at about a $3,800 payment. But if life is good, that's what I can afford. So that's all there really is to setting up the scenario manager. You've got all these different scenarios that you can create. What's nice is you can just quickly double click, take a look back, see what the outputs are, and so on. So we want to present this in a nice report. What I'm going to do is choose the summary, and I want to make a scenario summary. And in this case, the result cells, those are going to be your outputs. So I want the amount of the loan, periodic rate. I want all of these outputs. I'm just going to highlight all of those. So B9 to B14. Again, if you don't want all those cells, use your control key to select the ones that you want. Hit OK, and it churns for a little bit, and it just created a new sheet for me that shows you here's my current values, which match the current scenario. And you can see there's the worst case, the most likely, the best case. You've got all the outputs down here at the bottom, so you can find out how the total payments varied when we changed the years borrowed to 15 or 20. We've got the periodic payments and so on, and it generates this for us. So then you could, check on page layout to see what happens. What does this look like when we print it out? We want to add headers and footers and so on, but I'm just going to choose print preview quickly. And it's given me 2 pages, which I don't really want it on 2 pages. So instead I'm going to go back here, change my orientation to landscape, and that way I can fit it on just 1 page. So add your headers and footers and clean that up a little bit, but you can see you get, really a halfway decent report. So back to my spreadsheet. Here's the original mortgage sheet that I had. I'll hit Control Home to get up to the top of it. We'll save this. And that's all the different what if tools that I want you to be able to work with.